When I first heard about the weeping time, I thought the African slaves were crying because their families were being broken up. That was not the case. I'll talk about it coming up. This is KRT, Critical Race Theory. It's not the one they teach in law school, but the one banned in public schools. 2 miles west of downtown Savannah, Georgia, sits a historical marker in the center of a small plot of a fenced-in city park. The surrounding neighborhood is one of the most distressed and depressed sections of the city. Hood is probably the best way to describe it. The marker was dedicated on March 3, 2008. That's 149 years after a slave auction occurred. At the commemoration ceremony, a local man handed out dirt from Georgia to be sprinkled around the marker, and Savannah Mayor Van Johnson poured water over the dirt to consecrate the ground. And that was it for the city's commemoration of the event known as the Weeping Time. Contrast that with the towering monument to the Confederate dead that has stood for over a century smack in the center of one of the city's largest public parks. The Weeping Time acquired its name by the slaves and their descendants because of reports that it poured down rain for the full 2 days of the auction. It was said that the heavens were weeping for the inhumanity that was being committed. Pierce Butler, the owner of the slaves who were sold, inherited his wealth from his grandfather, Major Pierce Butler. In his time, he was one of the largest slaveholders in the country. Major Butler was one of the signatories of the U.S. Constitution, the author of the Fugitive Slave Law, and was also instrumental in getting it included under Article 4 of the Constitution. When Major Butler died, most of his estate and holdings, including 2 sprawling island plantations on the coast of South Georgia, were passed on to Pierce M. Butler and his brother John. One of the plantations produced rice and one produced cotton. There were more than 900 slaves who worked the plantations. Pierce M. Butler was an immoral steward of his inheritance. He regularly engaged in risky speculations and accrued a considerable amount of gambling debt over the years due to his compulsive card playing. It was these 2 factors that necessitated the appointment of a group of trustees seized control of his financial assets in an effort to return him to solvency. But it didn't work. By 1859, the trustees were still unable to extricate Pierce Butler from his debts, and it was decided that the movable property on the Georgia plantations would be split between Pierce and his brother John, and the half of the slaves that were allotted to Pierce would be sold at auction to relieve his remaining financial obligations. A small fraction of those obligations were the quarterly payments Pierce Butler was required to pay to his then estranged ex-wife Frances Ann Kemble as part of their divorce agreement. Now here's something that was ironic. Fanny Kemble, as she was called, was an avowed and outspoken abolitionist and had made much of the fact during the time she was married to Pierce Butler. This difference was a constant source of contention throughout their tumultuous 15-year marriage and ultimately contributed to its dissolution. When they got married in 1834, she claimed she knew nothing of how the Butler wealth was acquired, but she quickly found out after a trip to the plantations in 1838. Once Kemble found out about Butler's Georgia plantations, she begged him to take her down to witness firsthand what she'd previously only heard and read about in her native England. Despite his better judgment, Butler brought Kemble with him in late 1838 to visit the plantations, and what Kemble found was every bit as callous and horrible as she'd imagined. Kemble cataloged her stay in diaries, which were eventually published some years later as Journal of a Residence of a Georgia Plantation, and to this day, it's considered one of the most detailed eyewitness accounts of slavery during that period. Butler had forbade the publication of the journals during their marriage, but once their daughters were of age, Kemble felt free to let her account of that time be known to the world. Her journals ended up playing a significant role in the anti-slavery debate raging at the time. Now, Kemble was long gone by the time the Butler slave auction took place. Just a few months before the auction, the now infamous slave ship, the Wanderer, had landed at Jekyll Island off the coast of Georgia with more than 400 illegal slaves brought directly from the Congo. This was one of the last documented slave ships to arrive in North America, and it created a roiling controversy. The transport of slaves from Africa had long been outlawed, but owners of the Wanderer disguised their ship as a luxury cruise liner and brought back a hull full of human chattel. Records indicate that nearly 80 slaves died on the voyage. The crew of the Wanderer were awaiting trial at the time of the Butler slave auction, but the sentiment in the South was such that they were all eventually found not guilty and set free with impunity. This was the atmosphere surrounding the largest slave auction ever on American soil. The notorious slave trader Joseph Bryan was enlisted to conduct the Butler slave auction, and it was originally scheduled to take place in Savannah's Johnson Square, directly in the city center where Bryan's slaveholding pens and brokerage was. So he was going to make money on the auction and on the holding pens. But it would soon be determined that there wouldn't be enough room to accommodate the buyers they expected. So the location was moved to the 10-Broick racecourse that was 2¼ miles west of downtown. Weeks before the auction, Bryan took out ads in papers across the South advertising the sale. It became the talk of the town, and speculators from as far as Louisiana and Virginia came to Savannah to put in their bids. It was said that the hotels and bars were all full to capacity in the days leading up to the auction. This was the Super Bowl of slave auctions. Among the crowd was Mortimer Thompson, an undercover journalist sent to Savannah by the New York Tribune editor and noted reformer Horace Greeley to report on the sale. He posed as a potential buyer to get close to the auction, and judging by the reaction in the South once his piece was published, it was a wise decision for him to travel incognito. After the great auction sale of slaves at Savannah, Georgia came out in the Tribune, it was republished in Philadelphia and London and caused an international stir. Threats on his life from public officials in the South were issued. They claimed the piece was an anti-slavery hit job by Northern abolitionists. Well, in fact, that's exactly what it was. Thompson extensively recounted the events of the auction in damning detail for his article. He explains how, upon arrival, the slaves were stuffed into horse and carriage stalls in the racetrack. He said, quote, "Into these sheds they were huddled pell-mell without any more attention to their comfort than was necessary to prevent their becoming ill and unsellable." On the faces of all was an expression of heavy grief. He goes on to note that some of the slaves appeared to have resigned themselves to the hard stroke of fortune that was their fate as human property, while others sat brooking moodily over their sorrows, their chins resting on their hands, their eyes staring vacantly, and their bodies rocking to and fro with a restless motion that was never stilled. When Thomas recounts the auction, he holds nothing back. By its very nature, the sale of human beings is a disgraceful affair, and he describes the slave speculators as a motley lot poking and prodding the chattel, pinching their muscles and checking the insides of their mouths like livestock, all while making jokes and lurid comments at some of the female slaves. He goes into detail about a few of those who were sold, including a man named Jeffrey who attempts to get his buyer to purchase his fiancée named Dorcas, only to eventually be rebuffed when the buyer finds out that he would have to purchase her whole family to acquire her. Thompson also tells of a woman named Daphne who comes up for auction wrapped in a shawl with her infant to keep the chill air and driving rain from them. Thomas describes the scene as men crowding around her, jeering and yelling to the auctioneer, "What do you keep your nigger covered up for? Pull off her blanket." Another says, "Who's going to bid on that nigger if you keep her covered up? Let's see her face." The men gathered closer with remarks emphasized with profanity and mingled with sayings too indecent and obscene to even be hinted at. Thomas wrote some 20-odd pages relating to the events of the auction and its aftermath, including Pierce Butler showing up and extending a gloved hand to a few of his favorite slaves. Then after the auction, he gave each of those sold $1 in freshly minted coins, as if that were consolation to the families who had spent generations on his plantations and were ripped apart on those 2 days. It's a shattering portrait of the realities of the slave trade and deserves far more exposure than it had since it was first published. The city of Savannah should be commended for recognizing this monumental event with a historic marker. But one small plaque in a remote West Savannah park doesn't nearly do justice to the memory of the people who were bought and sold so many years ago. The racecourse where the auction was held has since been obliterated, and there's now a lumber company on most of the former site. An elementary school sits on one corner of the former racetrack, but there's not a single trace left of the old course, and it's probably safe to say that very few, if any, of the children who attend classes there even know what happened on those grounds a century and a half ago. This has been Critical Race Theory. Thanks for checking in. Like and subscribe. Leave a super thanks or buy me a coffee, and we'll see you next time.